It is pleasing to the gods to see a man honored by his enemies.
And such a beautiful enemy.
Something happened during the filming of the Ten Commandments that almost ended Anne Baxter's career overnight. One moment, she was a respected, award-winning actress. The next, she was being whispered about behind closed doors. Like she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The scene was bold, risky, but no one, not the director, not the studio, not even Anne herself, predicted the fallout that was coming. We are not going over the version they put in the press. Today, we are uncovering what really happened on the set of the Ten Commandments, and how one scene nearly destroyed Anne Baxter's reputation. Stay with me, because the truth is more shocking than you could ever imagine. Before the whispers, before the scene that nearly ended everything, Anne Baxter was untouchable. She had what every actress in the golden age of Hollywood dreamed of: talent, poise, and a gold statue to prove it. At just 23 years old, she won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her haunting performance in The Razor's Edge. Not long after, she delivered another unforgettable role in All About Eve, going toe-to-toe with Bette Davis as the ambitious and manipulative Eve Harrington. It was clear, Anne Baxter was not just another starlet. She was a serious actress with serious power. But Anne's image in the industry had limits. She was respected, yes, revered even, but she was not considered dangerous. She was not marketed as a symbol or cast for shock value. Studios relied on her to deliver elegance, emotional weight, and sophistication. For years, that mold worked just fine. She had climbed her way up Hollywood's brutal ladder and earned a reputation as one of the smartest and most capable performers on the screen. Nothing about her career hinted at controversy. Until the Ten Commandments. By the time director Cecil B. DeMille began casting for his biblical epic, Anne had already become a favorite of film critics and a familiar face to post-war audiences. But she was also at a crossroads. The kind of roles she was being offered were beginning to shift. Younger starlets were taking over the ingenue parts, and the industry was beginning to evolve. So when DeMille, one of the most respected and powerful directors of his time, handpicked Anne for the role of Queen Nefertari, it was more than just an opportunity. It was a lifeline. She took the offer without hesitation. Not because the role was safe, but because it was not. For the first time in her career, Anne Baxter would be seen not as the sophisticated schemer or the emotionally tormented wife, but as a queen, seductive, commanding, and dangerous. It was a major image shift, and it was exactly what DeMille wanted. But Anne had reservations. She was proud of her acting, not her looks. She had never been cast based on her figure, and she knew what the part of Nefertari would require: lavish costumes, bare shoulders, intense stares. The character was designed to smolder. And in 1956, when the Ten Commandments was released, that kind of on-screen heat came with consequences. Still, Anne said yes. She trusted the director. She trusted the film. And more than anything, she trusted that her performance would speak louder than the costumes. What she did not know, what no one knew, was that one scene in particular would cross a line so thin, even the studio would start to sweat. And once that footage hit the screen, there was no going back. The role of Queen Nefertari came with power, prestige, and pressure. From the moment Anne Baxter stepped onto the soundstage in costume, she felt it. The makeup was bold, the jewelry was extravagant, but it was the wardrobe that turned heads, and not just the ones behind the camera. Anne's costumes were designed to be opulent and sensual, reflecting the queen's seductive hold over Ramesses. But as the fittings went on, something became clear. This was not the usual DeMille drama. The dresses were cut lower, the fabrics thinner, the structure tighter. It was all technically within the guidelines of the time, just barely, but it pushed boundaries. Even for a biblical epic, the level of exposure raised eyebrows. She was fitted with flesh-toned garments underneath her costumes, meant to preserve modesty, but only just. On camera, the illusion was nearly flawless. At a glance, It looked as though Anne was revealing far more than the censors would normally allow. And to make things even more daring, DeMille insisted on dramatic lighting that highlighted every angle of her figure. There was one particular scene, short but unforgettable, where Anne stood in a sheer gold-accented gown under intense, glowing stage light. Her body was partially silhouetted, and though technically covered, the scene created an illusion of full exposure. The camera lingered, the music swelled, and the moment left almost everyone who watched it stunned. Anne herself later admitted she felt vulnerable during that shoot. She had always approached her work from a place of craft, of dialogue, expression, and emotional range. But in that scene, it was not her voice or her eyes carrying the weight. It was her body. And no matter how elegant the costume design was, she could feel that the scene went further than anything she had ever done before. DeMille, of course, stood by his vision. To him, Nefertari was a woman of power and control, and her appearance was a weapon, not just for seduction, but for dominance. Anne understood that on an artistic level. She respected the character, but there was no denying the risk. People on set whispered. The studio heads were reportedly divided. Some loved the daring presentation, while others worried that DeMille had gone too far. It was not just a matter of taste. There were rules, after all. The Motion Picture Production Code, known as the Hays Code, had been in effect since the 1930s, and even though things had begun to loosen slightly in the 1950s, there were still clear restrictions around how much skin could be shown, especially in a religious film. But DeMille was known for towing the line. He had clashed with censors before, and more often than not, he got away with it. This time, however, it was not just about the film. It was about the actress. Some insiders began to voice concerns that Anne Baxter's role might attract the wrong kind of attention, that her reputation, one built on depth and dignity, would take a hit. The studio began bracing for potential backlash, and as rumors about the scene started circulating ahead of the premiere, that fear only grew stronger. And the thing is, the whispers were just beginning. Trouble rarely starts with an explosion. It starts with whispers. And once word got out about Anne Baxter's scene, those whispers turned into quiet panic. Executives at Paramount were no strangers to pushing boundaries, especially with a director like Cecil B. DeMille at the helm. But this time, the pushback was different. It was not just about nudity or costumes. It was about how Anne Baxter, an actress known for subtlety and class, was suddenly at the center of something far more provocative than anyone expected. Internally, there was division. Some producers were confident the scene would be viewed as tasteful and artistic, a powerful moment for a powerful character. But others were not so sure. They saw trouble coming. There was concern that religious groups would take offense, that moral watchdogs would zero in on this moment and paint it as indecent, and perhaps most worrying of all, that Anne herself would be the one held responsible. The risk was not just reputational. There were conversations about damage control. Some insiders claimed that the studio discussed softening the marketing around her character, or reducing her presence in early promotional material. There was even quiet talk about whether the scene should be cut altogether. But DeMille was not budging. He had final cut approval, and he knew what he wanted. He believed the scene was essential to the character's power, and he was willing to defend it. Still, the tension was undeniable. Behind the scenes, calls were being made to industry advisors and press agents. Should they prepare for outrage? Would there be boycotts? Was Anne's image strong enough to weather the blowback if things went sideways? It did not help that the rumor mill was already spinning. Early test screenings reportedly left some viewers stunned. Whispers about the Anne Baxter scene began to circulate around Hollywood parties. People who had not even seen the film were already speculating about what she did and how far she went. Some described it as daring, others as inappropriate. And Anne? She was stuck in the middle. She had filmed the scene under the guidance of a trusted director. She had worn what was asked of her. She had delivered the performance with professionalism and grace. But in a matter of weeks, it no longer felt like a role. It felt like a gamble. What made things even more complicated was how Anne was being talked about. not as a performer, not as a character, but as a woman who had gone too far. And in the 1950s, Hollywood, that kind of narrative could stick fast. One wrong step, one misinterpreted moment, and an entire career could be thrown off course. Anne was not naive. She knew how fickle the industry could be, but she was still caught off guard by how quickly the tone shifted. She had taken on a role with depth, with conflict, with power, and now, suddenly, that was being reduced to a single image, a single scene, and a lot of very nervous executives. The film was still weeks away from release, and already, the damage had begun. When the Ten Commandments finally premiered, the reaction was loud, but not in the way the studio had feared. There were no protests in the streets, no sudden calls for boycotts. But that did not mean the scene went unnoticed. In fact, the exact opposite happened. People were talking, and not just about the special effects or the scale of the production. They were talking about Anne Baxter and about that scene. For many, her portrayal of Queen Nefertari was captivating. It was intense, confident, and, yes, undeniably sensual. The studio may have hoped to bury the buzz, but audiences had other plans. They were curious. Some were even shocked, and that curiosity turned into conversation. The censors, surprisingly, allowed the scene to pass. Just barely. Under the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Hays Code, strict rules were in place to prevent anything deemed morally questionable, particularly when it came to sexual suggestiveness or revealing clothing. But DeMille was a veteran. He knew how to frame things in ways that technically stayed within the boundaries, even if the implication was clear. Anne's costume may have been suggestive, but it was not explicitly in violation of the code. The studio did not receive fines or sanctions. There was no official penalty. Still, the letters came in. Some viewers praised her performance. They described it as bold, commanding, even iconic. Others were far less forgiving. Letters from conservative groups accused the film of disrespecting biblical stories. A few claimed that Anne's portrayal was inappropriate for religious subject matter. Some even suggested that her scenes were the reason their local theaters had refused to screen the film. And in an era where reputation was everything, those letters mattered. The industry response was equally divided. Critics acknowledged her performance as visually memorable, but debated its substance. Was she playing a queen, or a caricature of one? Was it acting, or simply shock value? For Anne, the feedback was bittersweet. On one hand, she had helped deliver one of the most successful films of the decade. On the other, she was no longer being viewed through the lens of her talent alone. Behind closed doors, casting agents and producers began to reassess how they saw her. The once versatile actress with dramatic range was suddenly being viewed through a narrower lens. Some wondered if she could ever go back to playing the emotionally complex characters she had once mastered. Others quietly removed her name from shortlists for upcoming projects, nervous that her presence would draw the wrong kind of attention. And yet, through it all, Anne remained composed. In public interviews, she was gracious. She praised DeMille. She spoke highly of the experience. She avoided controversy. But in private, it was a different story. According to some of her later statements, she had deep reservations about how that one moment defined her. She never intended to be seen as provocative. She did not want the scene to overshadow her work. And yet, no matter what she did next, people always brought it up. The scene had made an impact. There was no denying that. But it had also drawn a line in the sand. Anne Baxter had crossed it. And Hollywood, as always, was quick to decide whether that was brave or unforgivable. In the years following the Ten Commandments, Anne Baxter remained diplomatic whenever the film was mentioned. She called it a milestone. She praised the cast. She always credited DeMille with giving her one of the biggest roles of her career. But beneath the surface, her feelings about the film, and about one scene in particular, were far more complicated. It would take decades for Anne to publicly reflect on her experience with honesty. In interviews much later in her life, she revealed that she never fully felt comfortable in the role of Queen Nefertari. While she respected the film's scope and the historical significance, she admitted that she had misgivings about how she was portrayed. The grandeur, the spectacle, the extravagance, it was all there. But the version of herself that appeared on screen did not reflect the kind of actress she believed herself to be. She also expressed regret about how much the industry had focused on her physical appearance, rather than the substance of her performance. It was not just the costumes or the lighting. It was how those moments seemed to linger in the public imagination long after the film's release. While fans remembered the drama of Moses parting the Red Sea or the thunderous voice of God, many still brought up that scene. The scene that, to Anne, had become a distraction from everything else she had worked so hard to build. For someone who had once stood beside Bette Davis and commanded the stage with little more than a look, it was a bitter realization. One scene had reshaped how people saw her, and there was no going back. Privately, Anne also acknowledged that she had taken the role in part because she felt like her career needed a boost. The landscape of Hollywood was changing in the mid-1950s, and younger stars were rising fast. For an actress who had started in her teens and peaked early, the pressure to stay relevant was real. The Ten Commandments offered a chance to be part of something timeless. But in chasing that opportunity, she found herself stepping into unfamiliar territory. And ultimately, one she would struggle to reconcile. It was not just about the scene itself. It was about how the industry punished women for stepping outside the image it had built for them. Anne had spent years proving her worth as a dramatic actress. And yet, one moment, filmed under the direction of a man she admired, in a costume she did not choose, threatened to erase it all. To her credit, Anne never lashed out publicly. She never blamed DeMille, and she never turned her back on the film. But those close to her say she carried the weight of that moment quietly. And, for a long time, she had done what was asked of her. She had delivered the performance with total professionalism. And still, somehow, she was the one who paid the price. The controversy never officially ended. There was no moment where the industry stood up and said Anne Baxter had been forgiven. No public statement, no grand return to form. Instead, like many actresses whose image had been complicated by a single choice, she simply faded from the spotlight. Not overnight, but gradually, deliberately. In the years following the Ten Commandments, Anne found fewer opportunities in major studio films. Whether that was by choice or by circumstance is still debated, but what is certain is that her screen presence began to shift. She moved toward quieter roles, smaller productions, and eventually, television. And it was in television, that so-called second-tier medium of the time, where she found a surprising kind of freedom. Free from the pressure of blockbuster roles and controlling studio contracts, Anne was finally able to perform on her own terms. She appeared in The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, Batman, and dozens of other shows that allowed her to explore new characters and flex her range once again. Not as a symbol, not as a scandal, but as an actress. By the 1970s, she returned to the stage in a stunning full-circle moment. She took the lead in Applause, the Broadway musical adaptation of All About Eve. This time, she played Margot Channing, the very role Bette Davis had portrayed opposite her decades earlier. It was more than just a part. It was a quiet reclamation of her legacy. Anne's final role came in the 1980s, when she joined the cast of the television series Hotel, where she played Victoria Cabot, until her passing in 1985. It was a calm ending to a career that had known intense highs and some unexpected lows. A career that, for a time, had nearly been defined by a single moment on screen. But that moment never fully erased her. Despite what the studio feared, despite the backlash, Anne Baxter endured. She did not retreat. She did not self-destruct. She simply kept working. In small ways, perhaps, but always with purpose. Her story is a quiet reminder of what Hollywood rarely admits, that talent alone is never enough. That perception can be reshaped in a single frame. And that for women in the spotlight, especially those who dare to step outside their assigned roles, the price of one bold choice can echo for years. Anne Baxter made that choice. and she lived with it, but she never let it define her completely. Anne Baxter's story is not just about one scene, it is about the power Hollywood holds over the people it claims to celebrate. One moment nearly changed everything for her, but she kept going, quietly rebuilding her legacy on her own terms. She never apologized for the role, and she never let it define her. So the next time you watch The Ten Commandments, remember, behind the glamour was a woman who took a risk and paid the price. If you found this story eye-opening, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. There is more truth to uncover.